Okay, so welcome. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So we're here with the 1 year into COVID webinar on the changing role of technology and STEAM in young children's lives. We have a really wonderful panel here of affiliate students and alums from the Early Childhood Technology webinar. I'll be sharing more about that in a moment. And my name is Amanda Strawhacker. I'll be your MC for the afternoon or morning, wherever you're calling in from. I'm the Associate Director of the ECT program, and I'm the person you will talk to if you ever reach out about questions or want to learn more about what we do. We also have a tech moderator here with us today, Madhu Govind, and she's also a doctoral student at the DevTech Research Group, which ECT is really closely associated with at Tufts. She's going to be here for you in the chat if you have any questions, if you are having technical difficulties, if you want to share a Q&A item for the group. She'll be moderating the chat, so thank you so much, Madhu. And we're, of course, joined by three lovely panelists. So I'll just dive right in and start sharing about what we're going to talk about today in this webinar. So I always want to make sure we have an agenda so we know the roadmap of what's to come. We will first, I'm going to share a little bit about what we're doing in this webinar, why it's important to us to talk about children and technology in relation to COVID. I'll spend some time, you'll meet the speakers, I'll introduce them for you, and you'll get to hear from each of them on a guided panel discussion that will take about 20 minutes, probably the bulk of our time together. And then we're really conscious to save quite a bit of time at the end for your Q&A, your questions answered. And we'd love to hear from you. So go ahead and feel free to share in the chat where you're calling in from. Let us know what drew you to this webinar. Share questions that you have as we're going. We're going to have time to try as much as we can to get through all of those. And then, of course, we will have some reflections at the end. And if you're watching this live, then we'll be sharing all of this later on in a recording and email. If you're viewing the recording, then you can check in your inbox. You should also have the list of resources that were shared out during this webinar. And we'll also try to include a PDF of the slides for you as well, if that's all right with the speakers. But you can definitely have the organizational slides in the presentation. So just a note about who we are and who is the group hosting this event. The Early Childhood Technology is a graduate certificate program, is a 1-year blended online and in-person on-campus program for graduate credit that you would earn from Tufts University for anyone from really any background who is curious about how to bring technology into the lives of young children. So we have a number of teachers, museum educators, we work with people who are connected with shelters or are connected with foster systems, all walks of life of folks who just want to know there's got to be a better way to introduce technology. There's got to be research out there on how to do it in a playful and appropriate way. And in fact, there is. And at ECT, we spend all of our time learning with you and thinking with you about how to put that research into practice to see success in your setting with your kids. So if you're curious about ECT, then you can attend one of our upcoming application workshops or open houses. You can visit the website listed here, go.tufts.edu/ECT, to find more information about that, learn about our application promotions that I'm happy to share with you later on. But for now, it's important to know about the program because all of our esteemed speakers come from the ECT program in different ways. They're all affiliated with ECT in various ways. So before I dive into sharing a bit about them, I want to touch just a little bit. This is a very text-heavy slide. You don't need to read everything on it, but I was just even a quick Google of what's going on right now in the world of the pandemic and how children and technology are sort of becoming more and more of a question. You know, what children are learning during pandemic, how technology is helping with that learning, where are the gaps? So I thought it was really interesting. Recently, I read that, so the Pew Research Center and McKinsey and Companies are two really well-established and well-known survey and research institutions in the US, put out some surveys of thousands of US adults across the last year. And 2 or 3 really notable highlights. Since the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020 to what we would now call about the midpoint in October, we saw a pretty dramatic slide from parents with children younger than 12 years old from more than half of those parents saying that actually this pandemic is pretty easy, we're making it work, home and school, we're balancing, to by October, we're seeing close to half of that number is actually saying, this is getting kind of hard, this is difficult to balance. And of course, that distinction is a little bit starker among mothers than fathers, or people who identify as the mother figure than the father figure. There's also a trend, a really unsettling trend, that among those students who are perhaps lower access school districts, or in this, you can see this image here on the right, who are in a school that is primarily students of color. We're seeing that those students are having a harder time with this gap year. They're not getting the same level of education and experience that they would, compared to the gap experienced by primarily white schools. So there's not only a challenge of at-home family time, there's also socioeconomic and race-related differences. So there's a lot of challenges coming up now that people are sort of thinking about. When we come out at the other end of this, what is our new normal going to look like? What are the challenges we're going to face, and how can we address it together? So I don't think that I'm not going to put them on the spot and say we have all the answers in this webinar, but I think we have a really great selection of experts here who are going to share some of their insights and their perspectives on how the pandemic is going for them. So first, we have Dr. Amanda Sullivan. She's a lecturer at ECT. She teaches our Tech Tools for Learning course in the fall. And she's also an associate faculty member at the University of Phoenix, where she coaches doctoral students in educational instruction. She is a research consultant, educator, and author who focuses on the impact of new technologies on young children. Her research explores strategies for breaking gender stereotypes and engaging girls in STEM. She holds a master's and a PhD in child development from Tufts University, where she worked with the EdTech research group that's actually affiliated with the ECT program. It's almost like EdTech is the research arm and ECT is sort of the practice arm. She's the co-creator of the Scratch Junior Coding Cards, creative coding activities for children ages 5 to 7, and the author of the amazing book that I recommend to everyone, Breaking the STEM Stereotype, Reaching Girls in Early Childhood. Her work has been featured in GeekWire, Wired Magazine, the New York Times, and now the ECT webinar series. And she is a mom to 2 young children, and she didn't put it here, but a very adorable cat. She's also the former associate director of the program. So she had my role, and we're also best friends, and we're also collaborators on a bunch of projects. All of this panel is actually a collection of friends meeting here. Welcome to our salon. And thank you so much for being here, Amanda. We also have Jason Ennis. So Jason was an alum of the ECT program from 2017-2018 class. He is the director of curriculum, training, and product management at KinderLab Robotics. He is the director of curriculum, training, product management, and he also teaches or supports teachers, parents, and educators who are learning to integrate Kibo, a screen-free robot kit that we'll talk about in a moment, in meaningful and playful STEAM experiences for young learners. He leads professional development workshops and manages KinderLab's 160 hours and growing of live curriculum. He has presented on robotics, early coding, and Kibo integration at a number of conferences and workshops. And again, he's just a really wonderful person to talk to, and a great friend of the program and of us personally. So thank you, Jason, for being here. And last but not least, we have Angela Demick. Angela is the Senior Project Director for a DODEA, that's Department of Defense. Wait, am I going to get that right, Angela? Okay, Department of Defense. So I don't know the EA. Department of Defense grant in Norfolk Public Schools. She has enjoyed working in education for over 20 years, where she served as a special educator, school counselor, elementary principal, and a grant coordinator. So she's had almost every kind of job that you can in the hierarchy of public schools. She completed her PhD coursework in special education at Old Dominion University in 2017, and for the past 5 years, she's served as the project director for Operation Breaking the Code to College and Career Readiness, that grant, promoting early elementary computer science and social emotional programming to support elementary military-connected students in Norfolk Public Schools. Some of her favorite projects include a pilot study for K-2 grades in partnership with Tufts University, highlighting the Kibo Robotics Kit, and the family code events serving over 400 families in the past 5 years. She currently serves as a designee on the Virginia Department of Education Computer Science Framework Committee. And Angela is also a current student in ECT. She's a member of the cohort right now. So if you have questions for her about how this year has been going off the record, she can tell you the skinny on what it's like in ECT. And without further ado, we had set up a few questions for our panelists. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to pose the questions. They've prepared some slides and thoughts for you, and we'll just let them talk through their talking points before we sort of wind down and start to think about our Q&A. So our first question is for Amanda and for Jason. How have caregivers used at-home technology to support their children's learning needs? And how have our ideas about tech use changed throughout the pandemic? So what are caregivers doing at home? And what have we thought differently about tech throughout the course of this year? So I'll let Amanda go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me here on this amazing panel of people that I deeply respect and I'm happy to be in conversation with. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, many of us can agree we were using tech as a means of survival. And I say we because as a parent, but also an EdTech expert, I was not removed from this. We were using tech as a means of survival. In many ways, using technology and screen time as a virtual babysitter, as we were juggling working from home or unemployment or a myriad of health and other issues. And we were relying on more passive consumption of screen time and technology for our kids. Things like watching a movie or playing a passive app or video game so that parents and families could just simply get things done. And we knew that that's not the best practices of young children and technology, but it was something that we were doing mainly to just get by right at the beginning, especially in those early phases where it felt very temporary. And if you move on to the next slide, Amanda, I think experts started weighing in, and this is a great resource that you can still access these recordings today if you're interested, but the ISTE Early Learning Network, the International Society for Technology Education, put together this series of webinars right towards the beginning of the pandemic, where you could hear from media, technology, or education and child development specialists. And I think it's important to point out that even these experts were recognizing and telling parents and families to be forgiving with themselves and to understand that we're all, just trying to survive and get by, and to be forgiving with yourselves with relation to the screen time and media and technology usage that your kids are having. But if you move on to the next slide, thank you. I think as the pandemic progressed and we saw it wasn't as temporary as we all hoped and wished it would be, what we were doing with technology was not sustainable, and it was not, what we wanted for especially our young kids as the months and months went on. So in my own work and the work of others on this panel and other EdTech and STEM education specialists, we worked on sort of changing the way parents, families, and teachers were facilitating technology use at home, away from that more passive media and technology consumption and more into creative uses of technology, using technology for coding, engineering, and STEM. And in my own work, I really focus on hands-on STEM learning and hands-on unplugged uses of technology and engineering. We know that these early experiences with building and hands-on STEM is so critical to young children, and finding ways to support parents, teachers, and families to keep doing that, even if the instruction is going to be happening virtually, even if the instruction is happening on Zoom. How can we make sure kids are still getting these critical hands-on experiences? And it was really exciting to see that teachers and families really jumped on board with this and did a lot of really amazing and creative things to continue facilitating hands-on STEM learning for their young children throughout the pandemic and today. And I think this might be a good point for me to pause, because I believe our next panelist, Jason, can speak more towards how that happened with a specific tool like the Kibo robotics kit that you've now heard us mention a couple of times.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amanda. And I'll hand it off now to Jason.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. And thank you, Amanda, for the handoff. And I'm really happy to be here with all of you as well on this panel. So at KinderLab, we create and share with teachers the Kibo robot kit, which of course was developed at the DevTech Research Lab, building upon the work of Dr. Marina Bears and her wonderful graduate students, some of whom are on this panel. So at KinderLab, we share the Kibo robot, the curriculum, the teaching philosophy developed by Dr. Bears with schools all around the world, but we also share Kibo with individual families. And one of our goals at KinderLab has been to support parents who are interested in giving their children access to that kind of hands-on, kind of creative STEAM and technology engagement. Like Amanda was saying, you know, we all struggle with these different either passive or active participation with technology that we see in our children, and helping our children become active creators, active engagers with technology can really start very young if the right tools are there. So one of the frameworks that we draw upon at KinderLab when we think about this is this notion of joint media engagement and ways to promote kind of active learning where both the parent and the child are approaching a technology experience kind of together with that sort of open mind and with that willingness to each act as a learner together. And that's a powerful kind of gift that I think that we as parents or as caregivers can share with our children, showing our children that, hey, we don't really know how everything works right off the bat either. We can learn beside our child, and by asking questions, prompting questions for the child, by showing uncertainty and a comfort with uncertainty ourselves, we can actually empower the child who may be feeling that same uncertainty. So that was, we saw in the pandemic and this focus that parents were having on engaging with their children's learning as almost, you know, for all of the difficulties of the pandemic and the horrors of it, there were opportunities for parents to really engage in new ways with the learning that their children were doing. So if you don't mind advancing to the next slide, Amanda. So the research that DevTech had done into events like family days where parents and children learn together, that was research that we drew on when we created a series of at-home kind of learning lessons to support parents who were interested in teaching teaching their children sort of how to do kind of creative technology experiences, how to introduce coding as sort of a joint activity. So these the curriculum that you see here, a home robotics course, and then Amanda, if you don't mind jumping to the next slide, what we call the home edition of Kibo. These were both sort of versions of Kibo and experiences with Kibo that we developed during the period of the pandemic to support parents who were interested in introducing these experiences to their children. So we were taking the same sort of pedagogy in a way that's built into this hands-on creative technology education that is the heart of Kibo, and really just trying to find ways to make it available for parents to engage with in the home. Now, there are so many challenges that parents faced during this time period that we wanted to do what we could, but of course, there's only so much that any sort of product or solution can do to support parents. And of course, real overcoming those differences, for example, Amanda, in access to technology resources is really where you know, the importance of like the public school system and efforts like what Angela Demick has led come into play. So I know Angela is going to address questions of using these kinds of tools in education settings. But thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jason. Wonderful. So now that we've thought a little bit about what's going on, how our industry and schools kind of addressing what's happening at home, we're going to turn to how schools, companies, and informal spaces have adapted to remote or hybrid learning and what we've learned from a year in. So Jason sort of started to touch on that, and now we're going to hear from both Angela and Jason, really unpacking where we stand a year out from the beginning of this new normal that we're creating.
Thank you guys so much for the opportunity to share from a school district perspective. We have been privileged in Norfolk Public Schools to participate with that Kibo robotics program and delve a little bit into Scratch Junior. And so that's been a wonderful thing to see the joint engagement in our family events. But as we looked over the past year, I think many of the school districts were much like our school district. We were challenged in many different ways with the pandemic. And it was a blessing, but it was also something that was suddenly pushed upon us, that we suddenly had one-to-one devices. So the beginning of the pandemic, of course, we didn't have devices yet. We didn't yet know how long the pandemic was going to last. So like most school districts who didn't have one-to-one, we had a wonderful team of people who pulled together from all over the district, because we have 32 elementary schools, pulled together worksheet packets, and people were masking up and in the unknown and not really understanding what was going to be happening health-wise. People were getting out there and making sure that families still had access, and teachers making sure that students still had something to be learning at home and to be engaged with. But we know that that presented many challenges, because we have many families who maybe couldn't come by and get the packets. We had some schools, some school districts that had buses that would show up and deliver them to the different locations where parents could come and it'd be more convenient. We also had MiFi or Wi-Fi accessibility challenges in a large urban school district. So the district was able to purchase MiFis, even put some on buses and locate the buses within the neighborhood range so that families could access the internet. So the difficulty really began with just how do we keep kids engaged. And then we reached our dream within a few months of, we now have the ability to have one-to-one, which has been a dream and a plan that's been ongoing for many years. But now what do we do with that? How do we be intentional? And now we have wonderful teachers and staff who have never really done virtual online learning in the elementary world. And suddenly we're fully virtually online. And as we went through the first few months of the pandemic and into the school year, of course, everyone's hopes was that we would not be returning to virtual learning, but our district actually just came out of a full year of full virtual learning. So the challenges began to be, how do we get devices, enough devices, what devices to choose, how do we get those to families? And I think all school districts had multiple people pitching in to help with the children, like daycares. We had wonderful lunch teams that were giving out lunches every day. We just had a challenge of so many links and sign-ins for parents and, grandparents and uncles and aunts who were taking over for the kids learning, because we now had a challenge of how we're going to be able to help support the student in individual homes or multiple kids in one home. So the district was able to use things like Clever to help coordinate and Canvas. But again, all that comes with wonderful staff who's going to have to be a part of training teachers, the logistics of how do we get all this information like work packets and devices to teachers. And then we had the challenge of the emotional, physical well-being, like all people did across the country and across the world. We had an intense need for virtual teaching, professional development, but yet where would we have the time, because we're almost flying the plane as we're trying to build the plane. So it was a challenge, but I'm very proud of the work that we did in our district. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Okay, so thank you so much, Angela, for sharing a little bit about what was going on in the district and how you guys have learned so much from that. I'm going to keep an eye on the time, so I'm passing it over to Jason, and then maybe we'll have time for our little 1-minute reflections that everyone has thought a little bit about on our panel. So Jason, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. And so some of the challenges that Angela described are ones that we, in working with school districts over the last year, we've heard different models and different challenges, much like what Angela described. So we focused with Kibo on what we could do to help districts on trying to help teachers and districts see a range of ways that they might use resources like Kibo to support their learning goals. So Kibo represents a hands-on and sort of very engaging way to learn. But of course, if the district is entirely remote, then we need to focus on techniques like the teacher demonstrating and asking for student sort of feedback or participation over Zoom lessons. We can do things like movement games where the children act out Kibo's commands and then the teacher has Kibo act out those commands. But also where possible, we worked with districts that had a lot of Kibos and were able to actually set up rotations where Kibos would visit student homes and students would be able to use the hands-on resource for a period of time, and then it would come back to the school to be cleaned and cycled on. And that would allow us teachers to do activities like on the next slide, Amanda, you know, we might talk about Kibo visiting the homes the way a class pet might, and in the same way that a family might kind of document the adventures of the class stuffed animal at the home and then share that again when they return to school. Kibo could play that same role where Kibo's visiting students' homes, and then through either you know, the web conference or through like a share on a class document site, kids can share pictures or videos of the experience that Kibo had at their home, building that connection more strongly between the students' home life, the home lives of other classmates, and the school. And that was really the goal, that one of the goals that we were focusing on was using these experiences to enrich that connection between school and home. And we had some great feedback from schools and districts that were able to implement a program like that, that had helped build that kind of connection among the peers as well as the homeschool connection. That was something that made us pleased to see.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jason. So it's so interesting to me to hear how the districts were sort of pivoting and handling problems all the time, and industry was sort of learning from that. And Kibo is just one example of many that I've heard of who, you know, you're just trying as hard as you can to put out whatever it is, whatever resources are going to be useful for your audience. So it's real. Thank you guys both so much for sharing about that. And now we have just enough time to each kind of share our little 1-minute takeaway. As we move toward a new normal, what assets, methods, and infrastructures that we've learned about from the past year or developed in the past year do we want to take away, and what do we want to keep, or what do we want to learn from that didn't work? I'm interested to hear from each of you about your prognostications for the future. So first up, we have Angela.
So very proud of our district, how they pivoted so quickly with one-to-one. And so I call it the grows and the glows, that basically these are the ways that we were able to grow as a district and glow. So we really needed to come up with systematic teacher PD. We basically were taking all of our curriculum and putting into something like Canvas. So intentional and systematic PD opportunities, and creating that space on Wednesdays. We called it asynchronous days. And I think some wonderful things that came from the opportunity for parents to be more involved involves empathy. You know, teachers and parents and aunts and uncles and daycares really understood, wow, it takes a lot to really educate a student, and they all uniquely worked together in their various scenarios of how they were going to make sure that all children had equity and access. And it was really important that parents became more knowledgeable of what's going on with children's education, which the pandemic brought that. A device in the home or Kibo or different kinds of technology tools give the opportunity for parents to engage with their child. And then deeper learning too, it's very important that we see, as Dr. Sullivan mentioned, we want to make sure that students are using things like Flipgrid or Scratch Junior to show their learning versus just using apps where they're just going to be consuming and just doing taking in information and not really doing anything with it. So the Kibo was a wonderful opportunity. I do, we do, you do. We also had teachers who were able to use the Kibo and have the kids, like as Jason said, act it out at home or do their little Flipgrid video and share it back with the class. But I think one of the biggest challenges is how do we assess all this and do it safely? So that was a challenge that's ongoing as we still look at hybrid learning now. Next slide, please. So opportunities for new normal, we want to keep that individualized systematic PD for teachers. We want to make sure that we know where every teacher is in each school and that we can somehow individualize their the needs that they have for being a better teacher with digital learning. We want more opportunities like Kibo or Scratch Junior for cross-curricular units. That enables teachers to teach multiple subjects at one time. We also want to continue that parent-teacher and empathy and collaboration. We want to build upon that, get parent education even more as a part of what we're doing to help parents produce that 21st century graduate learner. And we had just wonderful people called instructional technology resource teachers. We need many, many more coaches and tech ed teachers to help make sure that teachers understand how to take their content deeper with technology and education. And then also rethink and redesign our school spaces. That's really important that we begin to look at how can we be more purposeful with places like libraries for maker spaces and things like that. So that's positive, and a growth mindset, of course, is what we all gained from this experience.
Thank you, Angela. I love hearing that your focus on this individualized PD opportunities and the ways that we need to support teachers with tech ed coaches and how we think about our environments. It especially warms my heart because it means that it's really useful for you, everything that we've been talking about in ECT this year, because these are all discussions that we have ongoing in our coursework. So I'm really, really happy to hear that there's crossover for you there for your new normal navigation. So next up, I think we have Amanda Sullivan.
Thank you. And I want to follow up with what Angela said about how just hearing her speak about what teachers and districts and families were doing over the past year. And she said that it was like trying to fly an airplane, but building it at the same time. And that just struck me. And I think that teachers would have every right to hate technology after this, to say, I don't want to see another Zoom, iPad. I don't want to see another robot. Like, I'm over it. I want my new normal to be just back to what we did before and not think about technology again. No one could hold that against teachers, but instead we're kind of seeing the opposite. And I think that that is really optimistic when we think about moving towards the quote new normal or moving ahead into the next academic school year, that this is just some research that was conducted by the EdWeek Research Center, surveying teachers across the US about their opinions about educational technology and their own abilities with technology. And I think it's really powerful to see that, you know, many teachers felt that their ability to effectively use technology improved a lot because of what they had to go through this pandemic. And that many of them, more than half, had more positive outlooks and more positive opinions about educational technology. And, you know, for me, that is extremely inspiring. And that tells me that there is something here that we can capitalize on going forward, that we can build off of this really well-deserved newfound confidence and competence that teachers have. They know they can do it. They were in sink or swim and they swam, and now they know that they can swim. So now how can we push this even further, as Angela and Jason said, with using technology in more meaningful and deeper ways, in terms of as a mode of self-expression, communication, not just for learning technical skills, but as a means to express yourself, and not just learning about technology, but learning with and through technology and demonstrating your learning through technology. I think that's something that we can do and is achievable moving forward, especially seeing that teachers have this positive growth in their outlook and their confidence. If you wouldn't mind clicking to the next slide, I just wanted to share this quote that really struck me. Innovation has suddenly moved from the margins to the center of many education systems. And there is an opportunity to identify new strategies that, if sustained, can help young people get an education that prepares them for our changing times. And I think this is so true. You know, what we've seen over the past year is we were forced to innovate. We were forced to do things in education that we had never done before. And it can be easy to just, go back to normal, but innovation is important. Thinking about what we can do differently is important. And these authors talk about leapfrog moments. And I think this is a leapfrog moment, a moment where we could make huge leap forwards in terms of what we're doing with education, and specifically what we're talking about in this webinar with education and technology, or not. And I think we need to do it, and we need to keep innovating, and we need to just move ahead at full speed.
Thank you, Amanda. All right, so now we're going to hear from Jason about your perspective on what to take away into the next phase of life, new normal, next school year.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, that's, I guess, to echo what both Amanda and Angela were saying, there's this this sense that all of this innovation was kind of forced upon us, and we needed to use these tools that that were new to us as teachers. That's so wonderful, that research you shared, Amanda, that 58% of teachers feel more positive after this year. That is really amazing when you think about how, like you say, how understandable it would be to feel like you don't want to turn on a computer again. But I guess one of the things that I really look forward to building on that is, so we've been forced to use this particular set of tools to make do within the pandemic. And yet we know from all the research about how young children engage with technology in particular, we know there are certain attributes of technology that work best for young children. Things like they are hands-on, they are screen-free, they do support kind of peer collaboration and small group work so that we can bring that social emotional component in. So when I think about moving forward, what I'm most excited about is that we have, like you say, Amanda, we've proven to ourselves that we can innovate in these ways. And yet now we look at this huge menu of tools that we can choose from. We're not forced to use this one style of sort of distance learning anymore. We're going to have that in our toolbox, but we're also going to be able to use some of these technologies and tools that work in ways that we know support the learning styles of young children best. So when I think about the new normal, I think about this wider palette of tools for promoting kind of creative technology use for young kids. So, it's a long way of saying we can get back to using Kibo in the classroom again, but in some ways, of course, that's what I'm excited about. But I think more broadly, we just come out of the pandemic with a wider set of tools for promoting this kind of experience. And we also get to hold on to some of these benefits like Angela showed about these stronger bonds, maybe between the caregivers, the life at home, and our sort of deeper understanding now of how children's home lives intersect with their schooling. So I think that it's an exciting time to be looking at the next few years of education.
Thank you, Jason. I couldn't agree more. So we have now, I just wanted to close out this section of our talk before we really just, I don't know if our panelists have another 5 minutes to stick around for Q&A, but I did want to highlight this one remark. I wish all of you in the audience could have attended our prep call, because honestly, just listening to the three of these panelists talk unscripted is really interesting and generative on its own. And one of the fascinating quotes that came out of that was from Angela, actually, where she was reflecting that, one of the benefits of this last year is that parents are now more aware of the intention behind tech integration, not just what tools you need, but why teachers care about it and what the learning can be for their child. And you said, now they're more aware of what should be happening, and I hope they continue to advocate for their children for the right kind of learning. We can't just go back to worksheets. So if that's not full circle, I don't know what is. We started with worksheets, we grew in innovation, we know so much more about ourselves and our tools, and we can't go back to where we were before. We've got to go somewhere better. I'm really, really excited to see where that takes the three of you and your learning contexts and everyone in this room. And now I know we're a little bit over time, but I wanted to make sure that we do have some time to hear from the folks in the audience who are listening in. So I'm going to just double check. We have a question. This is actually an interesting. What are some tools or apps you would recommend for at-home learning? And then this is sort of related. So what do you think about things like TikTok, the emergence of social media platforms that engage kids in creating often and collaborating? with others. So tools that you recommend, and if it comes up, maybe if there's a connection there to social media or tools that have emerged, whether or not you recommend them, what your thoughts are on that. So I don't I think you can just go ahead and speak up if you have thoughts about that.
I can start. I would say in terms of young children, tools that I would recommend, if you haven't heard of it and you heard us kind of mentioning it throughout this webinar, Scratch Junior is a free app for young children around ages 5 to 7 to learn about basic coding, but it's also a means for storytelling and creating interactive games and collages. And so if you have a tablet or a Chromebook or something at home, that's a great free app. And there's tons of free resources around Scratch Junior as well, free curriculum that you can explore. If you have a means of doing things hands-on, obviously Kibo, we love Kibo, but there's lots of other hands-on screen-free robotics kits you can explore as well. Things like Codapillar, Bebot, Kinderbot, and things like that you could be doing more of this like unplugged approach. As far as social media, I think social media is really interesting, and we could have a whole separate webinar on that. When I think about social media, I think about slightly older kids, not necessarily this tender 4 to 7 year old age range that ECT tends to deal with. But in terms of older kids and adolescents, my personal viewpoint is that social media can be a very powerful means to self-express, to connect, especially throughout the pandemic when you're so physically isolated from your peers, and that things like YouTube and TikTok allow creative use of technology. Here we were talking about, we want kids to be creators of their media, not just consumers of it. We can't say that and not also say, but we don't like when they make TikTok, or we don't like when they make things that they put out there. I think that would be a bit hypocritical. So I think, creating these really cool dances and tutorial videos and putting that stuff out there, that is creating media and putting your voice out there and expressing yourself. What I think is that parents need to be extremely educated about how these platforms work, what their kids are doing, and that there's a whole wealth of other safety concerns to think about when it comes to social media. But in theory, I think that it can be a powerful means of self-expression and connection through the pandemic and beyond.
Could I just jump into that, Amanda? I love what you said. I'm not going to speak to social media because we tend to be with the younger grades, but what's really neat is to find out what the teacher is using as far as tools in the classroom. Like our district only allows certain apps to be used and on the iPads that are being used. So it's really important if you're a parent at home and you've got these devices that you're engaging with education approved safe apps, and so Scratch Junior is a wonderful place to start. Kids easily grab onto those concepts, and they can use it a lot to show teachers what they're learning, or creatively for literacy or math, and there's all kinds of resources online for that. I agree, Codapillar and Think and Learn Codapillar actually has an app, which is wonderful. It's basic, simple coding with some simple math concepts. So, and Bebot is another wonderful tool, or Ozobot, things like that. So, but find out what the teacher is using, or the school district might actually have on the iPad itself, and try to engage with something like that. Code.org is great. There's something called Hour of Code, which is a wonderful way to explore different kinds of puzzles and games and computational thinking, like Dance Party. Kids love that. And so.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to echo some of the observations there. I think in a way, that question makes me think back to how we started talking about the idea of sort of parents as co-learners. And I think one thing that we can emphasize, whether it's Scratch Junior or Kibo for young kids or social media for older kids, is the parent sort of playing an active role in the creative experience. I mean, I love using Kibo, but I have a teenage daughter who's really into creating TikTok videos. And I've loved conversations with her where I ask her to, like, show me what you're creating. I ask her sort of how it works. She loves explaining like the system and what you used or how you create with it. And that's, even aside from Amanda, you observed that's so important about sort of safety and boundaries in that respect. But a parent can play a part in those creative experiences, not just as sort of the guardian, but also as a co-learner as well, even for a teen, I think. That's been my experience.
Yeah, I love that we've gotten into the realm of social worlds for young kids and for older kids because, you know, as Amanda pointed out, there's a lot of identity development that goes hand in hand with those spaces. And, you know, I think Angela and Jason, you just did a beautiful job of pointing out that identity development doesn't just happen with friends. It happens with your school community. It happens with your family. I've seen a couple of platforms that are actually developed for very young children. Maybe we can include those in the resources list later on. But they try to point out to parents to help kids locate, I've heard it called true friends. So if they have a real friend in the real world who they can identify using an email address or a user ID, they have a different sort of a chat relationship and chat permissions with those kids. So there are companies out there that are trying to pivot as well and make it more accessible, easier for even very young kids to have safe and generative, collaborative, creative experiences online. So I'm really glad that we got a chance to talk about that. I think we are at a little overtime, so thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. I'm just going to close the event right now, but I first just want to say thank you guys so much for joining us, for sharing your perspectives and your wisdom. I know that you've shared various forms of contact information, so if you are watching this live or belated, I hope that you do take the opportunity to reach out to our speakers. They're all lovely and wonderful to speak to and have a wealth of knowledge that I'm sure they'd be able to help you with. If you're curious about ECT, I did want to just share that we have a few different events coming up. So in addition to this webinar that we were very excited to host today, we've also got our 2020 webinar series. We recorded webinars similar to this on a range of topics. We talked about screen-based tech, maker spaces at home, how to help your child explore computers for the first time. There's all kinds of resources there, and you can find all the recordings still at the same place where you registered for this event on the DevTech website. So I encourage you to check those recordings out. And I already mentioned we have a couple ECT open houses coming up. So on the 5th of May, we have an application workshop. This is actually by request. A number of folks have asked for information about how to physically apply to the ECT program. And also a number of people turning to grad school after sort of thinking about it for a long time and wondering what the funding options are. So although we do not offer scholarships, we are very, very involved with everyone who is, and we're working hard to put you in contact. So if you want to come and think out loud with us about how you could fund your own graduate education, please come and join us on the 5th. If you want to learn about the ECT program in an open house setting and get some free resources that you can just run at home today, or activity ideas that you could get your wheels turning when you're thinking about how to work with your kids or your students in your remote or hybrid setting, come join us on the 12th. We'll definitely get you off on the right foot with our theme of messy making. So we're going to be talking about conductive Play-Doh and fun ways to get messy and explore engineering and making with kids. So on that note, I want to reiterate, thank you so much again to our panelists. Thank you everyone who's here in the audience. Thank you, Madhu, for telling me that my cursor was all over the screen and letting me know that that was a fact. And I will go ahead and stop the recording and look forward to hearing from everyone very, very soon via email. So stay safe out there. Thanks, everyone.